Friends, this is the last video of 2024 and I'm super excited because what we're gonna do is a very unique diorama, which I decided to call courtesy of US Air Force. We have the destroyed Panther from the previous video and now we need to give it an interesting paint job. There will be shading, oxide primer, rust effects, dust painted with acrylics, streaks of oil, shiny metal and much more. And there's also going to be a small surprise somewhere in the video, so you know what? Let's check it out. Assembled dioramas in their raw condition look really cool, but if you want to make them even cooler, we have to break them down into subassemblies so we can paint them. Here's my breakdown of the scene: wheels, exhaust, hull, figures and the scenery with a turret. Now I'm gonna cover everything with primer, and because it's extremely toxic, a particle mask is a must. I chose this primer because I wanted to post-shade the model, and because I ran out and couldn't find another bottle of black primer like anywhere. But to be fair, dark brown works much better with German dark yellow because at the very least, brown is a warm color. So in the end, it'll give the base coat a more normal look. It's not gonna look grayish and desaturated. And while we're at it, it's just nice to observe how the primer gives all these different materials and textures a nice, unified look, isn't it? The entirety of the painting will be done with AK lacquer paints. What I said about shading can be perfectly demonstrated on the road wheels. I choose the direction of the light and apply the paint from that direction. Shadowed areas will be darker, that's where the brown primer comes into play. Panther wheels are absolutely fabulous for this because one type is bulging outward and the other type is concave inwards. Lights and shadows for days, my friends. Another extreme case of this approach is the turret, which is completely hidden by the hull, and the textured Timerate makes the effect even more pronounced. Now, of course, we can't go with the same extreme approach everywhere. It all depends on the shapes and the orientation towards the sun. So the hull is gonna be much flatter. But we'll make it more dramatic with other techniques. This is all just a base coat, the very first layer, and as such, I'm using the paints as they come. I'm not mixing them with any other color to make them lighter, I just add a ton of leveling thinner. I loosely interpreted the camouflage from the box art which places the tank somewhere in Normandy, but what I'm doing here is a fictional, non-specific tank that totally could have existed on the Western Front. We just don't have photographic evidence of it. In other words, I wasn't concerned about the camouflage pattern. My only objective was to make it look plausible. The oxide primer is mixed from Tamiya paints. I used this recipe on my Ferdinand where I go much deeper because the entire tank is red, so go check it out if you haven't seen it. And yes, I'm painting the belly in oxide primer. I've seen this debated on modeling forums in the past, and this discussion comes up every once and then. And even on post-war vehicles, it was absolutely normal to have the belly in factory primer. I mean, it just makes sense, and it'll give the model a very exciting splash of color. Let me now show you something I wouldn't call my proudest airbrushing moment. I like to push my airbrushed base coats as far as I can because it makes all the subsequent weathering techniques much easier, and a part of this approach is an airbrushed pin wash, so to say, which basically means outlining pretty much every surface detail on the model with a dark color, in this case a black-brown ink from AK. However, I didn't thin it down properly, and as you can see, the results are pretty sloppy. But of course, this was all totally planned because I wanted to show you how it's not a big deal at all. After all, there's one more very important step that will nicely tie it all together. Let's make the oxide primer lighter with dark yellow. The amount of highlights you apply is completely a matter of personal taste, and I usually go with 2 or 3 layers. So what does this do? Well, it makes the model lighter, and that's always a huge win in my book. It also enhances the contrast because you can see how it intertwines with the previous layer, and lastly, it cleans up the airbrushed pin wash. The dark yellow was highlighted with white. I started by fixing any unwanted overspray on the swing arms, and the only reason it was there because I hate masking. Here, this might be a better example because the black-brown ink looked especially horrendous on the yellow color, but the 2 layers of highlights will make it nice and smooth. And again, I used a second, even lighter paint to add more contrast towards the edges and on some of the smaller fixtures. The red-brown camouflage was highlighted with yellow and white, and here I tried to make it look different from the oxide primer because when we think about it, these 2 colors are very similar. Green was also highlighted in the same manner, and the texture Zimmerit made all these efforts more successful because the deep ridges created exciting, prominent shadows. Finally, I sealed the entire model with a few generous coats of VMS flat varnish diluted with their acrylic thinner. This varnish has never let me down and it's in my opinion the best on the market. So if you're looking for a reliable varnish that actually dries into a perfectly flat finish, you can snatch it from the official VMS store or from Michigan Toy Soldier using the links in the description, and you'll get a small discount if you use my codes. Each purchase helps me out. Let's now give the model more life with enamel washes, and I'll be working with these new indestructible synthetic brushes. Now, the basics are simple here. The dark wash goes on oxide primer and into shadowed areas on the rest of the model, and the lighter wash goes on those surfaces that are painted in dark yellow. Enamels have a reasonably long working time, so I could comfortably apply them over a large section and then wipe the excess away with enamel thinner and a clean paintbrush. Now, I mentioned that these brushes are indestructible, and it's a topic I don't talk about too much, because here's the thing. They seem to be very durable, and all of them held that nice, sharp tip through this entire project, and that's something I haven't experienced so far. And when I cleaned them, the fibers remained brand new. Nice orange color, no residue from the paints. In the past, I thought that high-quality paintbrushes were necessary for acrylic painting, such as figures or chipping effects, and synthetic brushes were just supposed to be average at best. But I'm telling you, these are so good that I even used them for some of the acrylic painting. Of course, I'll see how they hold up after several projects, but so far they've been great, and I actually enjoyed painting this model much more thanks to them. Anyway, the model didn't change much because it was already post-shaded, but it looks crispier now thanks to the washes. Let's now transform it with acrylic paints and a variety of techniques. The first step is what I call an additional cleanup, because pin washes, even when you blend the excess, tend to darken the small details such as bolts and rivets. As a result, the model looks darker and smaller. But painting them in a lighter color, or even the same color as they were, makes them stand out, and instead of seeing a dark stain on the surface, you can actually appreciate the actual detail that was hidden before. The next step is kind of similar because we're still using lighter colors, but this time we're applying them with a sponge in a pretty messy fashion. These are the light superficial chips that technically don't go all the way down to the metal, but just scrape the surface, revealing a lighter color underneath. At least that's the theory, and the application is quite random, but luckily the process is very quick. It might not look like much, and we can refine it further with a paintbrush, but I just stopped doing that. The next layer is dark steel chipping. This is the effect where the paint is removed completely and we can see the dark color of the metal underneath. It doesn't look very good on oxide primer, and I kind of feel that primer was red on purpose just to make the chips and rust less obvious, but it definitely stands out on the rest of the model. This is also the reason I stopped refining the light chips with a paintbrush, because this step does the same thing. And there's also the fact that I feel like 95% of the light chips with a darker color anyway. This is also one of the ultra-precise painting techniques where the paintbrush is just as important, and I really like using this 502 Abteilung 000 paintbrush with long bristles. It's the one with the white handle. It holds a lot of paint and the long hair provides just enough randomness to make the chipping look more authentic, but I probably wouldn't paint figures with it. The amount of chips is, of course, up to debate, but I'm a firm believer that this effect alone can completely transform your armor model and give it a strong, battle-worn military look. Of course, we can enhance the look even further with rust effects, but first...
Let me tell you about something very special. That's right, merch. I never thought this would become a thing, but Pavel from Plastic Invasion just made it real. We spent a lot of time and effort on finding the best possible t-shirt, one that would feel comfortable and would last you a long time. The design is very minimalistic, something I personally vouched for, and honestly, I think it looks great. It's the type of t-shirt you should definitely wear on a modeling show, obviously, but you can also take it to the mall or when you're visiting someone. It's stylish, but very subtle, and those who know will know, and those who don't know, they'll just like it for how it looks. It's a super limited edition because right now we're just sort of putting our foot in the door, but if you like them, we'll expand this line with more scales and later with more designs. So if you want to represent the friends lifestyle, go and check out the link in the description. It's the official Plastic Invasion store, and snatch your t-shirt just in time for Christmas. Or at least I hope. Anyway, this is a very special occasion for me and I'm so happy to share it with you. But now it's time to get back to the Panther.
Rust effects are probably my second favorite technique right after washes. And over the past couple of years, I started to prefer oil paints over enamels when it comes to this effect. Oils are much easier to apply in small quantities, and when it comes to blending, they're just easier to control. And once again, this is something I didn't realize until I tried it, but brushes also play a huge role in this. Not just in how much you enjoy the technique, but also in the final result. Pointy, high-quality brushes just give you more control over the effect, and the results will be much better. None of this will, however, change the fact that rust zones on top of light colors such as this German yellow can stand out like a sore thumb. And if you have too many of these tiny rusty spots littered all over the surface, it can start to look weird. However, this is our lucky day, because we usually don't keep our models clean if we get this far, and earth effects always tone everything down to a reasonable level. All of these techniques combined will create an extremely exciting finish, so when we think about it, each day is our lucky day when we're applying weathering effects to our models. Let's now switch to acrylics again and paint some of the remaining details. The shiny metal axles were one of the things I was looking forward to on this model because they're gonna contrast so well with the rest of the tank. These parts were lubricated, so there's really no way they'd get rusty if the tank was still in use. While I had the silver paint at hand, I also added some chipping on the weld beads. They're another part of the model that gets very dark thanks to pin washes, and shiny silver chipping is the best way to bring those hand-sculpted welds back to life. Damaged wheels with missing rubber would be... I honestly don't know if there should be yellow paint under the rubber, or oxide primer, or exposed metal. But rust would look very appealing, so I just went with that. Another example of this acrylic oil symphony is the heat-corroded metal on the exhausts. A white base coat, dark rusty chipping with a sponge, some remnants of yellow paint on the bottom, and a generous rust wash with oil paints. Some speckling for added variety and visual texture, and these details were ready to be glued in place. When I received those new AK acrylic markers, I immediately knew they'd be perfect for road wheels, and this is finally a model where I can fully use their potential. It just saves you so much time, and not just on the wheels, but also on the tracks. And you can also treat yourself to a modeling Christmas present and get anything from AK's official store if you use my affiliate link in the video description. And you'll get a nice discount if you apply my sales coupon in your shopping basket. It's an affiliate link, so each purchase helps me out. Let's now quickly paint the chipped Zimmerit. Because I used resin sheets and didn't sculpt it myself, there are not many places with large exposed areas, so the extreme chipping effects are gonna be quite limited on this model. But still, the basic approach is the same as on my Yak Panther, where I demonstrated the technique in more detail, and it's honestly a fun method that makes the model look much more exciting. It's another example where I'm using those new synthetic brushes for detailed acrylic painting. Now, one thing I don't quite appreciate about this resin Zimmerit is the heavy texture. Sure, it looks absolutely fabulous, but it makes controlled chipping more difficult. On the other hand, if you don't fancy spending several hours chipping, it might be the best thing because the raised texture will guide your paintbrush. I could just let it skip over the surface and not even think about those random patterns myself because the texture would do the job for me. So now that I think about it again, it was actually good because it made my life easier. Okay, with all the detail painting finished, it's time for earth effects. Definitely not my favorite technique, but totally necessary. Let's start with acrylic mud texture, the first and definitely the worst step because it just makes you feel like you're destroying all of that hard work with some sloppy stippling. We can blend it with tap water for smoother transitions, but over the years I found that it's not entirely necessary. So ultimately, we just have to persist, be patient, and have faith in the final result. Speaking of which, the very next step makes the paint go away because pre-dusting builds upon the muddy foundation and expands it further. If the acrylic mud was applied to create volume and texture, pre-dusting blends it into the surface and creates a solid foundation for brush applied effects. Essentially, our goal should be to cover up the dark muddy paste completely and then add random, subtle patches of dust around it. We can make it more complex with the hairspray chipping method, but so far, I've been enjoying the simpler approach. Let's now put the airbrush aside and try these weird sounding paints. Gouache is essentially an acrylic paint that can be reactivated with water. Similar to oils or enamels, but gouache can be activated at any moment, even hours or even days or years later. It's funny to squeeze the paint out of the tube like oil paint, apply it and blend it like oil paint, but it's just acrylic. Now, this is really big news because back in the day when Adam Wilder had his modeling company, he introduced his Aqualine paints, which were the same thing, and in all honesty, they were my favorite when it came to dust and dry earth effects. No other paint would replicate the same effect, especially when it came to streaks of dust on the sides of my models. But because Wilder has been out of business for years now, I just stopped using them even though I still have them, because why show and praise something that you can't buy anymore, right? So I'm super glad that Adam helped AK to develop their own gouache paints and now they're back, although there are some differences. These, for example, take a while longer to reactivate than the old Aqualine. And if there's too much surface tension and they bead up into small droplets, you just have to keep blending and it'll be all good after a while. Now, a dusty tank might look a bit boring, and that's why before proceeding any further, I like to finish a small test section to see what works and what doesn't. So let's now do the same on the rest of the model using these two enamel paints. Again, the premise is very simple. Each color that's darker should cover a smaller area, and we should focus them around corners, details, and large clumps of earth. The advantage of acrylic dust is that no matter how hard you try, you won't be able to reactivate it with enamel thinner. So there's just no chance for you to accidentally start mixing the two different earth tones together. Everything will be nice and controlled. Now, sadly, the same thing can't be said about the darkest tone, which, by the way, isn't even a designated earth color, just some random streaking rhyme. But then again, if you're careful, the two layers won't get mixed too horribly. You could always let the previous effect dry for a day, but if you like to work faster, such as I do, just Being careful and not tapping the surface too hard will do the job. Of course, speckling plays a huge role as well, and it's good to separate it into two distinct effects. One covers a large area, but the paint is heavily diluted, and the other is much more controlled and also involves a thicker, more opaque paint. I also use streaking grime and a super long liner paintbrush to apply a few dark streaks on the sides. The pattern of the Zimmerit is very helpful here because it acts as a guide for straight lines. Once all of this was done, I could finally assemble the running gear. I had to make sure the lights and shadows were facing in the proper direction before I secured the wheels with superglue, and once they were in place, I added the broken track. This was also held in place with a few drops of glue, and actually, I didn't even film the weathering process because it was done with the same methods as I've just shown you. The only neat little detail is painting the cleats on the outer side in a silvery shiny color, and then giving them a subtle rust wash to indicate that this tank was operational not so long ago. And that actually wraps up the weathering of the tank. At least for now, because the finishing touches can be done once it's glued to the base, so let's focus on that now. I'll start with a quick airbrushing job. The idea is to lay down a very simple foundation similar to the pre-dusting on the tank, but because the ground is more three-dimensional, a bit of variety won't hurt anyone. I wanted to keep the darker tones at the bottom of the crater and lighter colors on the slopes around it. Not much of this will be visible, but that's kind of the point of base colors. If nothing else, it will act as a guide for enamels. And because painting large sections of the ground with enamel washes can quickly turn into a monotonous and boring job, over the years I tried to figure out a simple workflow that brings you good results. The main objective, besides making the ground look realistic and interesting, is matching it to the earth tones that are already on the tank. As such, I'm using the same colors, covering the entire ground with the earth wash, and while it's still wet, I apply the streaking grime around rocks, large clumps of earth, or generally where I want some artificial shadows, such as on the slopes or at the bottom of the crater. Suddenly it's not so boring and the results are immediate. And as a finishing touch, some additional highlights can be applied with a light dusty tone in the form of dry brushing. Sure, I used acrylics on the tank for that, but this works much quicker on the groundwork. Now it's good to dry fit everything and see how each element works together. At this point, I was also able to see which areas would be completely out of sight, so I could save some time with the next step. And that would be painting the large boulders and smaller rocks with acrylics. With small rocks, it's totally simple. You just paint them in a different color and that's pretty much it. But larger pieces need a more elaborate paint job than that. I'm not a stone Jedi, but what works for me is painting them in several grayish and sandy tones, starting from a dark brown base coat and finishing with the lightest, almost white color. Also, if you employ the wet blending method, the colors will mix with each other, creating more authentic results, even though it might not look like much while the paint is still wet. Now I could glue the tank to the ground, and at this point, I usually like to use PVA glue because it gives me plenty of time to make corrections, and once it dries, creates a strong bond between pretty much anything. I waited with the final runs of oil until this point because the tank is resting at an angle, and there's just no better way to paint these vertically. I'll admit that the effect might be exaggerated, but I think it plays an important role in the visual storytelling and makes the whole scene look more dynamic. And even if I like to use random blackish brown colors for all kinds of stains and streaks, here I went with pure black enamel, so it would be pretty clear what the effect represents. So that's gonna be it for the Scenic base and the tank, and all that's left now are the figures. I painted them in my traditional black and white pre-shading style, which for me is the smoothest, most straightforward method. Honestly, I'm not a good figure painter, so having a method with the least resistance, so to say, is ideal for me. Creating the basic lights and shadows with an airbrush, and then blocking in the actual colors with diluted glazes. That alone would lead to pretty flat looking results, so I always make sure to enhance the lights and shadows even further with diluted black brown and a very light version of the base color. If the finished result looks off, I can always shift the color where I want it with a glaze, which also tones down the harsh transitions. This method doesn't work so well on light colors, and the jackets on both of these figures were quite difficult to paint properly. But it's also because US soldiers usually had plenty of gear, and the more details you have to paint, the longer it's gonna take you. That's why figures with no backpacks, pouches, weapons or anything are such a pleasure to paint. It also doesn't work as well on skin tones or very small details, so when it comes to these, I'd rather base coat them in a black-brown color and then apply the main color and 2 highlights. If the contrast is too harsh, I can always tone it down with a glaze or 2. So there we have our 2 anime protagonists, and when I say that they were a lot of work, I'm talking almost 40 hours of painting. I'm probably just an extremely slow and inefficient painter, but hey, I'm trying my best. So I finally superglued them to the ground, the metal pins in their shoes providing extra strength, and my mission was over. So there we go, my friends, that's another finished diorama. I said in the previous video that this was the final model from this year's bucket list, and I'm really glad that I actually managed to finish it in time. Something I noticed about myself is the total inability to estimate how much time will it take me to finish a model, and this was no exception. It's a very simple scene when you think about it, but it took a lot of effort. I might or might not said that I had something radical planned for it, but ultimately I decided to keep it traditional, and I'll keep that idea for another model, and no, I'm not gonna spoil what it was. I also noticed that I totally lost the confidence and steady hand when it comes down to specific techniques. For example, I had to re-watch my old video on painting spare tracks because I just couldn't figure out how to paint them on this one. So that led me to an idea. How about we make the next model old school? Like Night Shift from 3 or 4 years ago, just to try and get some of those skills back. Let me know your thoughts. But before that, I want to sincerely thank you for watching these videos, because if it wasn't for you, I wouldn't be building models for a living, and I can never thank you enough for it. All of this is also possible thanks to my incredible patrons. My whole Patreon page is like a Night Shift magazine subscription, as I post there pretty often. And you'll get updates from my workbench where I share my thoughts and insights. We can get in touch through DMs, comments and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos, and those stay there forever, so you can always get back to them. I also have some extra goodies such as 3D models which you can use for detailing your projects, a bunch of real-life references for nature, old buildings and so on, and last but not least, these high-resolution studio photos which show the diorama in more detail than video ever could. It will help me a lot, but no pressure. Anyway, getting this model done was a sprint to the finish line, but I'm happy with it. And now I can start another project at a more relaxed pace. This will also give me time to prepare for the holidays and also enjoy a week off during the festive season. And with that, I want to thank you all so much for your support this year, and I wish you all the best for 2025. And I hope you'll spend some quality time with your loved ones. Thanks again, I love you all, cheers! Co? Jeha. Friends. And there will be shading, oxide primer, rust effects.
I never thought this would become a thing, but Pavel from Plastic Invasion made it